Welcome to Amidst the Chaos, the podcast where we dare to find God in the middle of real life, not just the highlight reel. I'm your host, Amber Gallion, and around here we build on one foundation only, Jesus. In each episode, I'll share my journey with God, wins, wounds, questions and all, and how He brings order, clarity, and peace into the chaos of everyday life. So take a breath, bring whatever you're carrying today, and let's lean into the one who never changes, even when everything else does. Welcome to episode 2. I'm really glad you're here, and I especially appreciate you if you've already listened to the first episode and decided to come back for more. So, in the last episode, I shared about my house of subconsciousness. I highly recommend going back and getting the full explanation on what that is if you missed that episode, because it gives some context on this episode. I'll give a quick summary though. We zoomed in on my divorce, that moment in June 2023, where I felt God take me by the hand and lead me out of a situation that was hurting us both. And we talked about how a year later, in June 2024, I saw my house of subconsciousness again, restored on the inside, but with men all over the garden. And I told you about the prayer where I kicked them all out and said, Lord, no man is allowed into this garden unless he is the man you have for me. And I shared how my ex-husband moved from behind the lamppost to the fence, only to tell me he wanted to be the right man, but he wasn't. And God underlined that with something as practical as a stolen bank card with my married name on it. Then I ended with that scene of the man in my garden, someone I met at the gym where I also started working, a man who somehow got past the fence and into the yard, and how that confronted me with my trust issues, trusting God timing and trusting myself in relationships. And today I want to tell you the vulnerable part of that story, how that situation unfolded at work, how it led to confusion, rejection, and public humiliation, and how all of it hit me right in my visibility wound. Because that wound is one of the biggest reasons I waited so long to share any of my journey with you. So there was a man at work I honestly believed God was highlighting to me. I don't say that lightly. I'm not someone who randomly decides God told me this every 5 minutes. I wrestle with things, I test them, I overthink them if I'm honest. But in this case, I had several moments, nudges, impressions that made me think, I think God is asking me to pay attention here. And for a long time, I did nothing. Or when I did, I self-sabotaged. I was scared. Scared to be wrong, scared to make a fool of myself, scared to be that girl who reads way too much into things. And on top of that, I just walked away from my marriage. I just prayed that radical prayer in my garden, so the stakes felt high. And at some point, I came to a crossroads. I realized I was more afraid of being embarrassed than of being disobedient. And when I put those two next to each other, I knew which one I never wanted to choose. So I decided I would rather risk humiliation than live with the constant question, what if I was supposed to say something and didn't? So, with fear in my stomach and my heart beating way too fast, I stepped out. And I went to him and I asked if he was interested in getting to know each other. And he said no. That's it. No lightning from heaven, no dramatic music, just no. And I want to be very clear, that is his full right. He has free will. He does not owe me a yes just because I felt God nudge me. Before I went to him, I had already decided whatever his answer would be, I would accept it. So I went home and I prayed for him, not as my future husband, but as a person, as someone I genuinely wanted to be happy, even if it would never be with me. I told God, Lord, you're still my God, with or without this man in my life. I'm safe with you, even if this is just a big awkward no. And if the story had ended there, this episode would be a pretty simple one. A story about courage, a clean no, and moving on. But that's not what happened. So the next day, I walked into work assuming it might be a little awkward, but that we'd handle it like adults and then get back to normal. Unfortunately, it didn't go like that, and it became clear pretty quickly that our conversation had not stayed between the two of us, and I started to notice looks, snide comments, and whispers that stopped when I walked in. The kind where you don't have hard evidence, but your body knows exactly what's going on. And unfortunately, that quickly turned into a long, slow burn of public humiliation. People who hardly talked to me before suddenly had opinions about me, and on paper, nothing huge had happened, but there was no massive blow up, no HR meeting, no written complaint. But emotionally, it was a whole different story. I had stepped out believing that I was fixing what I messed up, but by doing that reminds me of Luke chapter 14, verse 11. It says, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." The Dutch translation uses a different word than humble. It uses a word that I would translate as humiliate. And by believing it was me who needed to fix everything, I didn't allow God to work his magic. So I tried to fix it and got humiliated for it. And my sharing this story with you is in obedience to the Lord. So I'm humbling myself and maybe in some eyes even humiliating myself. But I trust that this time He will exalt me, that He has a plan with me sharing this, whatever it may look like. So back to the story. 2 months after the rejection, I broke my fibula. It was a simple accident with a complicated impact. Just like that, I was at home with my leg up and a whole lot of time to think. Those 6 weeks at home became an unexpected gift. Away from the stares, the whispers, the daily awkwardness, I was able to breathe again. I could feel my nervous system finally starting to calm down, and in that space, I made peace with what had happened. I could see the situation a bit more clearly. I believed something, I took a risk, I got a no, and that happens. That's life. But what I didn't deserve was the way it played out afterwards. But I could say to God, honestly, I don't regret stepping out. I did the best I knew how with what I believed I needed to do while leaning on my own understanding, to be honest. And it brought me closer to you. By the time I went back to work, I thought I was mostly done emotionally, and I imagined we'd all just move on. But the people weren't done. The way some people looked at me, differently this time, by the way, they no longer looked at me like I was crazy, but like something had shifted in a good way and that they knew something I didn't. And it kept stirring that same question up in me. It's like, what if I wasn't crazy? What if there was really something there? And it messed with my head. Not only because of him, but because I felt like my whole being had become a story other people thought they had the right to handle however they wanted. And somewhere in all of this something deeper was touching me. That was my visibility wound. At a certain point, I saw my house of subconsciousness again, and the house itself still in good shape. The renovations we talked about in the previous episode were still there. The rooms were whole, the windows were intact, the garden was okay, but the hedges around the garden had grown sky high, thick, dense, blocking everything from view. You couldn't see the house from the street anymore, and you would have no idea there was even a beautiful restored home behind them. And that's when it clicked. I had started hiding, not by becoming a recluse, but by slowly withdrawing my heart from being seen. On the outside, I was functioning. On the inside, I was crouched behind those hedges, thinking, if nobody can see me, nobody can turn me into a joke again. Nobody can misinterpret my heart. Nobody can weaponize my vulnerability. And suddenly, a lot of things made sense. It made sense why it felt so hard to post on social media, why the idea of sharing my journey felt dangerous, and why even recording this podcast felt like stepping into a spotlight I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. I knew some former colleagues were still following me online, and I knew exactly who might be watching. And part of me was convinced there were people just waiting for me to fail, ready with commentary the second I stuck my head above the hedge. I even changed gyms, moved to an all-female one, a place that felt softer and safer. But spiritually, those hedges were still there. A while later, I joined an online business prayer meeting, and we were put into breakout rooms on Zoom, praying and prophesying over each other. And one of the women who didn't know my story looked at me through her webcam and said, I don't know what this is about, but I feel like something happened at work where you were treated unfairly, very unfairly, and the Lord wants you to know that He saw everything. He heard everything, and He is very pleased with how you kept coming back to Him. You did not become bitter. And that went straight through me because she was describing exactly what had happened without knowing any details. And that last part, you did not become bitter, hit me the hardest because, it was true. I had been hurt, I had been humiliated, I had been confused, but I had not become bitter. I kept running back to God, sometimes angry, sometimes sobbing, but sometimes just exhausted and quiet, but always back to Him. And later, when I saw my house of subconsciousness again, I realized that that was the difference. The house was still standing because instead of letting bitterness burn it down, I had let God keep rebuilding it. The problem wasn't the house, the problem wasn't even the garden anymore, the problem was the hedges. And that brings me to why this podcast exists. Recording this, speaking into a microphone about the most vulnerable part of my story, is me trimming the hedges. Every sentence I speak here is another branch that comes off. Every time I choose to be honest about what really happened and where God was in it, I'm choosing visibility over self protection. Not reckless exposure, not telling every detail to everyone, but refusing to let old humiliation dictate my obedience now. Because here's something I've had to confront. If the enemy can destroy your house from the inside, he'll try to convince you to hide it. He'll whisper, stay quiet, don't post that, they'll laugh at you again, you're not credible. And as long as you agree with that, your story stays locked inside you, safe, maybe, but also unable to help anyone else. It says in Revelation chapter 12, verse 11, "And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death." God didn't restore my house so I could live in it alone behind an overgrown hedge. He restored it so that He could live there with me, and so that my life could become a testimony of what He can do in someone's chaos. I still don't fully understand why that man is still standing in my subconscious garden. He's still there. I've tried to kick him out in prayer more than once. I've told God I don't want him there if he's not from Him. I give that situation back to God again and again, and I trust that He knows what He's doing, even when I don't. But this much I do know. If I didn't have God, my house would probably have been destroyed many times over by now, burned down by bitterness, vandalized by shame, flooded by fear, and it's still standing because He is faithful, even when people aren't, even when I'm confused, even when I'd rather hide behind a hedge. So, as I close this episode, I want to speak to you if any of this sounds familiar. Maybe you've been humiliated in a place where you dared to be vulnerable. Maybe you stepped out and it backfired publicly. Maybe people made you into a story you never wanted to star in. And maybe, just like me, your house is actually in a better shape than you think, but your hedges are higher than ever. If that's you, I want to gently invite you to start trimming. Not by pushing yourself to overshare, not by forcing yourself into the spotlight, but by asking God, Lord, where have I been hiding what You've already restored? And what is one small way I can be faithful and visible again? For me, this podcast is that way. It's my act of obedience and my way of saying, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. If God is for me, who can be against me? And if you've listened all the way to the end, you're now part of this hedge trimming moment too. Thank you for being here, for listening, for letting my story touch yours. I pray that as you walk with God, you'll discover that He's not only the one who rebuilds your house, but also the one who stands with you as you step out from behind the hedges and become visible again. Thanks for listening to Amidst the Chaos. I'm your host, Amber Gallion, and my prayer is that today's episode helped you see Jesus a little more clearly right in the middle of your own mess and motion. If this encouraged you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that God is building order, even when life feels anything but stable. Until next time, keep walking, keep wrestling, and keep building on the only foundation that won't move, Jesus.